Hi,
Hello.
good evening Europe and good morning to US, and welcome everybody from all over the world to our webinar. And today, as you can see from the photo, it is still very cold winter here in Turku, but spring has come early for Vaadin developers. My name is Matti Tahmanen, and I've been working with Vaadin and related tools for years, but I can safely assume that I know less about Spring than our average listeners today. But that's why I have two very good Spring experts here, Petter Holmström from Vaadin.
Hello.
And Josh Long, straight from Pivotal. And Josh will be joining us with...
Hi.
Josh is straight from his home from San Francisco. And it's 6 a.m. in the USA, or what's the clock?
Good morning.
Yeah. And Petter has several years of experience doing some real projects with Spring and using Vaadin UIs in those. And I probably don't need to list merits of Josh related to Spring. He'll be discussing with us about new features of Spring and Spring Boot. Our original plan was to first that Petter would present some Spring 3 related industry proven methods to do integration with Vaadin, and then Josh would just discuss about new stuff that has come in Spring 4 and in Spring Boot. But we had a rehearsal earlier this week, and there we had one prototype that I had tagged together with Spring Boot and Vaadin, and guys got really excited about this, and they actually spent several hours of developing a better integration, and also they came up with some new integration libraries.
Yeah.
So today we have much better examples to show because of this rehearsal, and but before those we will also discuss about those
Old ones. Yeah.
legacy style integrations. And I think also not all of our audience knows that much about Spring 4 and Spring Boot, because even Petter didn't know that much about Spring Boot before this week. So it's probably best that Josh will start with some introduction to Spring and Spring Boot. So we can now switch Josh's screen on.
Yeah.
There.
Okay, Josh, you're live.
Josh, please unmute your microphone.
Good morning,
Yeah,
guys. Sorry
okay.
about that. Not nearly enough coffee, you know.
I can
So
understand.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. My name is Josh Long. It is, as Matti just indicated, very early here in the West Coast in the U.S., and I'm happy to be joining you guys right now. Let's ever so briefly look at kind of the latest and greatest that's happened to both the Spring projects and the Spring team. First of all, I don't know how many of you guys knew this, but the Spring team moved. We're actually part of a new company. We are now part of Pivotal. So if you're used to hearing about Spring Source, it's basically the same thing. Same team, same technology, same everything. We're part of a new adventure called Pivotal. It's a company founded on open source. The Spring team, along with the Grails and Redis and Tomcat teams and the Groovy language teams and Gemfire and all that, all of us moved to Pivotal, where we joined the Cloud Foundry team to build they're building an open source platform as a service, Apache 2 licensed, and then we also have our own Hadoop distribution. So it's really a company just sort of all from the bottom up, founded on open source, founded on enterprise, founded on technologies to build today's applications as well as tomorrow's. And of course, as part of that, I'm very happy to be here talking about the integration story with Vaadin. When we talk about Spring itself, there's quite a bit, of course. Most people know about the core Spring framework, which, by the way, in December just released 4.0, and just a couple days ago we released 4.01. Beyond that, there's of course a lot of other libraries that provide sort of focused support for different types of vertical domains. Here's a pretty architecture-ish kind of diagram. The top tier is the I/O execution layer, which describes 3 different entry points into this Spring I/O platform. The first one is Spring XD, which is a turnkey big data appliance and runtime. It's easily deployed, and it's meant to handle and scale out batch and online analytics processing kind of jobs. Then, of course, there's the Groovy language-centric rapid application development framework called Grails, which is a web framework. And then there's Spring Boot, which we'll look at it in far better depth during this webinar. Boot is the entry point into the Spring platform. It's the easiest way to get started. And of course, once you've entered the platform from one of these 3 different channels, you can take advantage of the rich APIs and facilities that the platform itself provides, including our integration APIs, the batch processing and support for big data, our rich web tier support, which marries very nicely, by the way, with Vaadin. And that includes Spring MVC, which is by far the most widely used web framework in the world. So that integration with Vaadin is very tight. It's very clean. The data tier, of course, is cross-cutting. We support both relational and non-relational. And then, of course, there are things that are kind of core to the whole platform and that you can use at any tier and on any vertical, including the core Spring framework, Spring Security, which is actually our number 2 most widely used Spring project after the core framework itself. And then, of course, the Groovy language and our reactive message bus and framework called Reactor. Right. So there's a lot of technology here. We're going to focus on just the bits that are concerned with building really awesome web applications. One thing we're really striving to do with this new frontier, this new adventure, is to make Spring and its associated technologies just as simple as it can possibly be for anybody and everybody who are looking to get started. As part of that mission, we've launched a brand new website, so don't hesitate to find us on spring.io, where you can find, among many other things, numerous getting started guides that feature easy, simple to follow, 10 to 15 minute long introductions to one focused task. So suppose that you'd like to build a web application that talks to Facebook or Twitter, that uses a REST, or that is mobile friendly in that it serves up resources that are specific to different types of devices, or perhaps you want to deal with messaging or whatever. There's any number of guides, and hopefully we'll see a Vaadin guide there in the future. And the idea here is that you can go to these guides, spend 10 to 15 minutes, download the code, look at the code, follow the steps. There's no magic. Every step is accounted for, everything. So from 0 to 60 in 10 to 15 minutes. There's a lot of other great resources here, of course, but I like to call people's attention most specifically to the guides. Of course, this isn't much of a change, but all of the Spring projects are on GitHub, and instead of it being at Spring source, they're now at Spring-projects. So don't hesitate to find us there. We're always happy to get pull requests and so on. Okay, so first things first, Spring is ultimately a container that manages beans, right? These beans are, it's a description of which class, the scope of that class, and the properties that class has that the container needs to be able to do its duties. But it doesn't care how you give it that description. If you give it that description of the classes and the beans and the properties and the dependencies and so on using XML, which is by far the most well-known, I think, approach, that's fine. But there are numerous other ways to approach this, right? So if you're using Scala, there's no reason you couldn't use our Spring Scala project and configure things using the Scala functional configuration idiom. If you're using, if you're used to Grails, or if you've ever used Grails, then you'll know about the Groovy Bean Builder, which is a Groovy-centric way of building and configuring Spring applications. Here's the equivalent Groovy Bean Builder definition. This facility, by the way, is now a part of Spring 4, which, as I mentioned, has just been released in December. So you don't even have to use, you can just get it from Spring 4 directly if you're using Groovy. And of course, then there's Java configuration. So Java configuration is my favorite way of working. It's my go-to style for anything that requires configuration. Here you have a configuration class. You pass this class literal to a application context implementation, and then it goes through, invokes every method with @bean on it. The return value is stored in the context and made available for injection and so on, just as if you had written a bean element in XML. Any of the dependencies that I have, I can inject as type by type or by using @qualifier. If I want to further disambiguate by bean name, so I just declare those dependencies in the method arguments, and those are going to be provided for me by the container. This is a very nice way to go, of course, but as you'll see later, more often than not, you don't even need to do configuration. Especially with Spring Boot, there's no reason at all to write configuration for the 80% case. Certainly. Big feature, big part of our Spring 4 release, of course, is something called is our great support for Java 8. I think Java 8 is a really, really great story for developers today. Of course, there's lots of great new features, including lambdas, which is, in my humblest of opinions, very, very overdue. It's a little embarrassing that C++, a language whose governing body meets but once or twice every few years, has managed to, spec out and then deliver lambdas in their language before we even got it. But don't worry, there's hope. Lambdas will be available first quarter, second quarter of this year, last I heard. There's a release candidate, a developer preview that was released last year that's very good. So if you have a chance, do check it out. It's quite nice.
I have actually had better success with Java 8 than with Java 7 lately. Java 8 has been more stable on my Mac than Java 7, so when I've been developing, I have been using Java 8 lately.
Yeah, it's wonderful, right? There's no reason not to try it out. And it's a developer preview, so we released Spring 4 against Java 8, even though Java 8 isn't quite yet final, but there's no reason to expect that the code won't also work once the GA hits, right? Here's an example of using something called method references. Basically, it's just a syntax for handling and referencing method literals, as opposed to weird reflection hacks that are reliant on strings and so on. So here I have a fairly common example. This is the JDBC template, which has been around for forever and a day. It's just a convenient object for dealing with JDBC. So here I say JDBC template, query for object. I pass in a query. That second argument is supposed to be an implementation of the row mapper interface. Well, the row mapper interface and so many of the other interfaces that are provided by Spring are an implementation of the functional interface. They're what Java 8 calls a functional interface, in that they can be substituted in Java 8 for a lambda or a method that satisfies the same contract as the interface itself. So if the interface has one method and the method takes a result set and an integer and returns a type of t, a generic type in this case, then there's no reason you can't substitute that implementation for a method that has those same that same contract as we do here. So it's going to call the map method as though it was an implementation of rowmapper.map, passing in a result set and an integer. So that's really convenient. For me, of course, I spend far too much time on Twitter, so I'm a big fan of Lambda syntax itself. It makes it so that I can actually do useful enterprise code inside of a tweet, which is a big win. Java 8's really good. If you get a chance to check it out, do. And Spring 4 is the first sort of enterprise, real framework to be able to support it in a big way, and along with all the other features. We're also big. We have a very big interest in supporting all the new JSRs, or at least the ones that are going to be useful. So, for example, the JSR 310, the date and time API, which is basically the standardization of Stephen Colburn's amazing Joda time libraries, that is supported all throughout Spring wherever you might want to use it. In addition to, of course, to the standard java.util.date and Joda time support that we already have there. Spring 4 includes best-in-breed WebSocket support. So, of course, we build on top of JSR 356 if it's available in some of the few containers that support it. Tomcat 8, notably, will have WebSocket support, and that WebSocket support has been backported to Tomcat 7.0.4 or whatever, 7.4 something. So that's fine if you want to use it. But again, that's relying on the application servers to upgrade, and that may not be an option for a lot of people. So we're very pleased to offer an alternative, which is built on top of the native support provided by different containers. This support works right now. You can use it in most containers today. It also offers a fair superset of the support available from JSR 356, including the SOC2JS protocol. So both on the server side, we support standing up a SOC2JS server, and on the client, you can of course just use the SOC2JS client, or you can use something like Vaadin's amazing WebSocket support, for example. And we also support Stomp. So Stomp is a messaging protocol. Its frames work very nicely on top of something like WebSockets, and it's much more natural a API for developers to use. If you look at the JSR, it's just a straight WebSocket. That's like giving you don't want to give a developer a raw java.net.socket basically and say go build something interesting, and nor should you give them a WebSocket either. It's too low level. So Stomp is far more natural and idiom. We'll look at that right here. Here's an example of a WebSocket controller. Two different methods here. One to receive messages being sent from the client. This is the first method, handle trade order. And you can see we've even injected both the trade, which is the converted message coming in from the client to a Java type, and then the JavaX.security principal, which is injected and provided for us by Spring Security here. So you can do secure communication over WebSockets and so on very, very naturally. In this case, the message will arrive at this controller. Whatever gets done, and then the result will be sent down to the topic greetings endpoint. The method below is the method that's invoked whenever a client makes and establishes its connection with the service. So this WebSocket support is very succinct, and it should be very natural for a lot of people to get started very quickly. Spring is always has been and always will be very much about portability. It's no surprise then, of course, that two of the top three most prolific application server destinations are destinations that can only run Spring. They don't support full Java EE. So, for example, Jetty and Tomcat are two of the top three, along with JBoss. And of course, Spring works just fine on numerous ranges of Glassfish, WebLogic, WebSphere, etc., and JBoss. Going back all the way to, in the case of WebSphere, the latest and greatest versions of WebSphere 1.0, whatever. So 2006 era generation technology, and you can build modern applications today. But by no means is this the only destination. Spring is a very portable thing, so we support cloud deployment. If you want to use Cloud Foundry or OpenShift or Heroku or Google App Engine or whatever, you can run your Spring applications and your Vaadin applications by extension on any of those destinations as well. Makes it a very nice choice. So I think that's kind of like a good brief look at all the new stuff in Spring 4, and we'll look at Spring Boot in just a bit. But for now, let's hand it back to Petter.
All right. So, before we move on with this really new and neat stuff, we're gonna have a quick look at how you used to do this Vaadin and Spring integration, since there are a lot of applications out there that still use this or might need to use it. So the first way that might be even the first choice that comes to mind is the so-called single Spring context. So that means that you have a single Spring web application context, and inside of this you configure multiple UIs, and these UIs are all prototype scoped, and then you might have some session data that is also session scoped that you can inject into these UIs. So all UI components are prototype scoped only, and I want to point out here that in Vaadin 7 the session scope can only be used for non-UI beans. So in Vaadin 6 the session scope worked for UI components as well, since we had only one application per session. But as of Vaadin 7, where we can have multiple UI instances in the same session, we can no longer use the session scope. So in this case, without any third-party add-ons, the prototype scope is the only one that we can use. The advantage with this approach is that it's pretty easy to set up. all you basically need to do is override a few things in the Vaadin application servlet and make sure that your UI is detected by Spring, and then you can just go. It's also pretty easy to inject backend beans into the UI with this approach. And if you're looking for integrations in the Vaadin directory, the Spring Vaadin integration add-on follows this approach pretty much. And I also like to point out that this Spring Vaadin integration add-on, it's the most popular one to date, and it's not an official Vaadin add-on, so it's not supported by us.
But it was easy enough, so
Yeah.
I could.
Yeah.
I could even.
Even Matti managed to get an application up and running with this add-on, and that's something already. Yeah. So of course, it's not the perfect approach, this one. So all beans are prototypes. So after the creation, they are not managed anymore. So if we register any listeners or something, we need to manually clean up after ourselves. So we can't rely on Spring doing that for us. Another common problem with this is the so-called serialization of backend bean references. So most of you who have been doing Vaadin applications know that we store absolutely everything in the session. And if you want to have this session replication between nodes in a cluster, for example, then the entire UI needs to be serializable. And by injecting backend beans into your UI and not making them transient, you're efficiently rendering your application non-serializable, and this is a bit of a problem sometimes. Also, application events are not propagated to prototype beans. So if you want to listen to application level events that are published on the Spring application context event bus, you need to do some custom wiring to get it working. And I actually have a little code example here that we're gonna look at. All the code examples, by the way, are available in GitHub, and we will post the links under the YouTube video once the webinar is done. So the first one, what you would need to do is, let's start with this simple web XML. So this is the old-fashioned way.
So you have to use XML there.
Yeah. So this is all the old-fashioned XML. We have the web app, context loader listener. This is Spring stuff. You can note that we're not registering any servlets here because we're still using servlet 3.0. Then in the application context, we have basically this one context component scan line that scans this package and all the sub packages for annotated Spring managed beans. So that's the.
And of course, all of this, as well as the web.xml, could just be done using Java config.
Exactly.
In Spring as well.
This is how it used to be done. Then we have the servlet here. There's some stuff. This is stuff related to getting the locale internationalization, marrying these together with Vaadin and Spring. If you don't need this, you can just skip this part. This is the interesting thing here. So in order to get this integration done, and this is something that this Spring Vaadin integration add-on does for you as well, is you create a new UI provider, and inside this UI provider, instead of creating the new UI with this standard Java new operator, you just ask the application context to give you the bean. And then the UI would look something like this. So we have standard Vaadin UI. It's a prototype scope bean. We have this stereotype annotation on it. We can auto-wire in beans, for example. In this case, we're auto-wiring in the message source. And then we're just implementing this in the normal Vaadin way. And I can invoke methods on this bean. And this would probably cause serialization exceptions if we try to serialize the sessions, if this isn't a transient instance. And just to show you that it's actually working, I'm going to run this example as well using this Jetty runner. So you can see it works. I can change the language. And that's about it. Okay, so that's one of the approaches. The second one that's commonly used, maybe not as common, but it has a few advantages, is this AspectJ approach. So in this case, we're actually compiling our entire project. Now something happened with our, okay.
Yep.
So we're actually compiling our entire project with the AspectJ compiler and letting AspectJ handle all this bean integration for us. So all UI elements, including components, so not only the main UI class, but basically any class which contains UI components, you can annotate that with this @configurable annotation, and then you can inject backend references using AspectJ into any UI class. And if you're using aspect-oriented programming, you can also apply advice to any method in any UI class. But this requires the AspectJ compiler. And the advantage of this approach is that you can add this to existing projects that are not Spring aware. So you can take any Vaadin application out there, just add the @configurable annotation, run it through the AspectJ compiler with a few configurations, and then you can start injecting Spring beans. And as I said previously, AOP can be used anywhere, and one big advantage with this approach is that these transient instances are also handled properly. So if you inject any backend beans into your UI, make sure you mark them transient, and then you can forget about it, because AspectJ will take care of them during deserialization. So if you are having problems with your Spring managed applications and serialization, then AspectJ could be one solution. Of course, it has some drawbacks as well. First of all, it requires you to use the AspectJ compiler. Whether that is a disadvantage or advantage is perhaps up to you. It depends on your camp where you're standing. Also, you might want to use an IDE that supports AspectJ, and luckily most modern IDEs should do it right now. At least Eclipse and IntelliJ and NetBeans does this. And also debugging can become a bit more difficult, especially if you're having bugs in aspects, because it's not always very clear how the program flows and so on. I actually have a code example of this as well. Let me bring it up for you. AspectJ. So again, application context contains a bit more stuff, and again, this is something you could also do in Java, but here I'm using old-fashioned XML code. And again, web XML, we have the ordinary context loader listener. And then if we move on to the code, this is a chat application, so there's a bit more classes here. I'm not going to go through all of them. Basically, we have a chat service that when it receives a chat message, it will publish it on the Spring event bus, and then the UIs will catch the event from there and update them. And in case anybody is wondering, I'm using polling here to get these events to show up and the UI to update itself automatically. So the servlet, as you can see, this is a standard Vaadin servlet, so there's no need for any Spring integration here, since we're letting AspectJ handling all that for us. And here you can see I'm using this configurable interface here, and using it here in the chat view as well. Here I'm injecting a few stuff from the backend, and they are all marked as transient. And AspectJ will make sure that this works also after deserialization. I can also use post construct, but other than that, this is written in sort of old-fashioned Vaadin way. So it could have been written in a non-Spring environment, and then I could just have added all these configurable annotations and so on, and then it would just work. And I'm just gonna run it for you here to show you. There's a slightly more complicated project setup to get this AspectJ running. So if you're using Maven, you need to configure the Maven, the AspectJ Maven plugin. But once it's compiled, I can still run it normally using the Jetty plugin. And here we can have the rooms. I'm gonna open up another chat window here so that you can and try to show them here next to each other. Just a minute. Let's call this one Peter and this one Joe. And a room. As you can see, it showed up here in both windows. So now I can go to the room and just type something. So this is a simple Vaadin and Spring application using Aspect-J. But this is still the old way of doing stuff. And originally I hadn't really planned to show you anything else than this. But then Josh got involved. And things started to happen, and things started to escalate, and we ended up throwing out almost all of the old webinar and restructuring the entire thing. And so what we're going to show you now is something completely new, because it didn't exist 2 days ago. And that's how to get Vaadin and Spring Boot to work together. And now I'm going to hand over the stage to Josh.
Okay, can you guys see me?
And I can see myself also.
Yeah, we're still
good.
There, okay.
Okay, so thanks for that. Yeah, those first two approaches are very good, but thanks to the beauty of coffee and a little bit of open source and some elbow grease, we've put together an alternative integration that builds on top of something called Spring Boot. I want to just briefly introduce you to that. Spring Boot is a convention over configuration approach to building applications that build on top of the Spring platform. There are many different layers to the technology, but it's a combination of tooling as well as runtime and APIs. It's all about focusing on that which matters. We have two different, supported routes you can start with. Of course, you can use any language you want on the JVM, but in particular we have great integration with Groovy. So if you want to write a Groovy language script like this one, for example, and then just use the Spring command line tool, this will actually create a working web service. This will create a RESTful endpoint, and you can tweet it as well, which is nice. Okay, so let's take a look at Spring Boot and how to use it to really just take your productivity to the next level, if at all possible. First of all, there's a pretty little website here called start.spring.io you can visit. There's a wizard if you're using our Eclipse distribution, which is called the Spring tool suite, which is freely available. It's open source. There's a wizard you can use that basically just is a front for this web service. So I'll just show you the web service directly. So you can use this with anything, right? Eclipse, NetBeans, IntelliJ, whatever. You go here, fill out some information. You specify which kind of technology you'd like to work with. So we're not talking about specific frameworks here per se. We're saying this is the nature of the kind of work I would like to do. And there are many more out there. For example, we're building a Vaadin integration. So these are just the ones that we know about from us. So you might, for example, specify that I want to build a web app, get some actuator support, and I'll explain that in a second. Perhaps I'd like to use JPA, maybe do Redis or whatever, and then you hit generate. Choose just a Maven POM if you like, or do a Gradle build or a Maven project, which has 2 stub Java files as well as a Maven POM. Go ahead and hit generate and download the resulting zip file. And then the zip file, I've already got another version of that same zip file here. The zip file contains just a very basic working Java project, which you can open up. If you go to the command line here, like that, tree, you can see we've got 3 files, one pom.xml, an application.java, and an application test.java. So nothing particularly elaborate, but it is just an easy way to get started. I'm going to open that project up now. Go to the desktop here. And yes, I would like to open that. Thank you. New window. Thank you. Once we're started, you can see even our Maven POM, our project description is fairly unassuming, right? So there's The very large majority of this is focused on the repositories, the plugin repository and the repositories themselves. Once we go GA, this will all be in Maven Central, so there's no need for there won't be any need for any of that eventually either. Other than that, you've got 4 dependencies. We have these correspond roughly to the checkboxes that we checked in the wizard. So start a web, actuator, JPA support, and here's test support that comes out of the box. And we have, these are aggressive, opinionated POMs. They bring in useful combinations of technologies to do a certain thing. So instead of having a bunch of optional dependencies, this actually brings in everything you need to get started with doing web programming with Spring. It's not, some assembly required. It just works, right? That leaves you with this one class, application.java. It's got the Spring Boot Spring application.run call. This returns an application context, by the way. So if you wanted to just work with a regular application context, just like normal, you can, but again, you don't need to. And you notice that this is public static void main, right? So what's going to happen is Spring Boot is going to analyze this class. It's going to look around. It's going to look at the environment. And it's going to do whatever it can for us based on convention. So let's take a look at what I mean. We'll go ahead and build a very simple application here. Let's suppose I've got I want to manage customer data. Yeah. So first of all, I'm gonna use a little cheat sheet here just to make sure we keep on time. Let's manage a little bit of JPA. Yeah. So first things first. Here's a JPA entity. I'll create a new class called customer. Get rid of that. Paste. The very large majority of this code is, that's the gist of it. That's the quintessential pieces of it. The rest of it is just boilerplate. Here's a constructor you need for JPA, and here's the getter and setters and so on for JPA. So really, it's just stuff you can auto-generate with your ID. Nothing particularly fancy there. I want to be able to work with JPA entities quickly, and of course, Spring Data provides a very, very useful feature called a repository, which is an interface-centric way of, based on convention, building and using repositories to handle all that sort of CRUD, create, read, update, delete sort of logic that's common with a lot of applications. So I'm going to create a customer repository. Get rid of this, interface. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to extend JPA repository, customer, long. So now I know, whenever Spring Data, when Spring Data sees this, it'll automatically make available an implementation of this class at runtime. And this is actually, I can even take this further. I can say, find all customers, find by first name, and then it's at param, first name, etc. So that implementation based on convention will basically look like this. Let's see, right? That's the JPA query that will automatically, based on the convention of the method name itself, be generated for us at runtime. I can use other types of repositories. For example, there are repositories to talk to MongoDB, to Redis, to Neo4j, to Elasticsearch, to Gemfire, to JDBC, etc. So there's a lot of different options, and I've just listed the ones that I could remember off the top of my head. With that out of the way, I think we have enough to kind of see things working. I'm going to go ahead and @enable JPA repositories. We want to get to, you might be asking, okay, well, that's great. It's great that you've got an API to work with data, but where's the data coming from? Out of the box, this already has an embedded HSQL data source, and out of the box, in the absence of some other data source that you explicitly configure, it'll automatically provide one for you. And taking it a step further, I can actually go up here, create a new directory, resources. Go ahead and update my Maven project here to recognize the new source directory, and then by convention, Spring Boot will automatically load whatever data is inside of data.sql if you have one, right? So again, cheating a little bit here. Let's see. I want these 3 records here. Okay, I'll go ahead and run this. What else do we need? What else would be nice? An endpoint, a RESTful endpoint to actually deal with this. So let's create a customer REST controller. This is a very basic Spring MVC controller for dealing with for building a RESTful endpoint for data. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to send back all the customer data in the database. probably not advisable in production, but it does demonstrate what we're trying to demonstrate. I'll at AutoWired the customer repository, like so. Request mapping. Okay, this not. So these repositories, by the way, by virtue of the fact that they extend JPA repository, include convenience methods like find all and save and delete and so on. So they handle CRUD as well as these custom queries that you provide. Okay, so we got a REST controller. This will listen to requests going into /customers. And we have a custom repository here. And we have our entry point into the application. Let's go ahead and run this thing here. So again, by default, since we have HSQL or H2 or Derby on the class path, Spring Boot will automatically create an embedded database for us. And it'll put the data in there for us as well if it finds the data.sql file. And it'll start up the web app, and it'll register the controller, and we didn't have to configure anything, right? So out of the box, localhost, that's the entry point for which we specified nothing. Customers. There's the data for our application, right? So going back and forth. Let's see here. Let me switch accounts here to get the better plugins. Close this. So here's the data coming back from our database. 3 different records. Very, very quick. Spring Boot comes production ready. So out of the box, you get endpoints. Here's the endpoint to check the health of the application. You can actually see which requests have been made to which endpoints, Vaadin or not, and you can see how many requests have been made, the memory, etc. You can get to look at the current, stack. If you wanted the stack trace as of right now, this is basically a JSONification of that stack trace. You can look at a you can introspect to the Spring application context itself, by going to the beans endpoint. All of this stuff is just based on convention. If you don't want it, just comment out the actuator dependency. So this is fine, but it could use some polish. I think we could really do better here.
I can easily read that JSON format, but probably my wife can't.
Well, but I think as nice as this is, nobody goes to a REST endpoint and works with that directly. I think we need a user interface, don't
definitely.
you? So let's talk about Vaadin, yeah? Did you want to say anything, or should we just dive into that?
Not really. Let's just show it how it works first, and then I can yeah.
Okay. So let's go ahead and introduce a Vaadin user UI, basically. First things first, you need to have a couple extra dependencies. So I'll go ahead and grab those here. These are basically, I'm just going to replace what I've already got. So this should be the same or better. So boot, support for web, actuator, data, JPA, and test should all be there. Get rid of that. Test, data, JPA, actuator, web, it's all there.
Vaadin.
You need the Vaadin version as well.
Yes, we do. Thanks for that. Project of property. Do I have any yeah, here we go. Get rid of that. Don't need this or that. At enable auto import, and that looks like it should be happy. And with that in place, this is all we're doing is we're referencing the Spring and Vaadin or Vaadin and Spring integration that we've been working on recently. With that in place, it's now no problem at all to start building a user interface component that just works automatically. So I'm going to go ahead and create a customer UI. Move that up here, get rid of this. Okay, so this should look fairly approachable, I think. It's a regular class, extends the Vaadin UI type. We're using the venerable tried and true table here. Of course, this is a very simple example. But all we're going to do is inject the repository interface that we've used before in the RESTful endpoint, and we're going to call the records and then use that to drive this table that we're going to display. Because we've got an existing Spring MVC kind of endpoint for the REST stuff as well as the Vaadin stuff, it's nice to be able to just parameterize where the Vaadin app itself lives. With Spring Boot, we try and do as much as we can through, as simple and as easy to use queues as possible. So by default, if you have an application.properties file on the in the resources directory, it'll automatically be consulted, and this makes it an ideal place to stick things that you want to configure quickly. So I go here, grab this guy here, paste that in there, and what this will say is that the Vaadin endpoints, the Vaadin user interfaces should all be served underneath that. So Vaadin for the win, /*. That should do it, don't you think, guys?
That should about use it.
Am I missing anything?
Just run it and see what happens.
Absolutely. Only one way to go. Here we are. And by the way, remember this application, again, I'm running it from public static void main. You can deploy this to any servlet 3 container, of course, but by default, if you don't have a web server and you just want to, rinse and repeat and iterate very quickly, we provide embedded support for Tomcat. You can switch to Jetty if you want, or Tomcat 8 if you want, just by changing the class path. So if you provide the Jetty dependencies, it'll automatically use that. If you provide Tomcat 8 dependencies instead of Tomcat 7.0 whatever, it'll use that instead as well. So that's worth checking out. Now then, so this is still there, right? That's fine. And then here's our gorgeous looking Vaadin powered table, complete with data access logic and sorting and all that. So, I mean, that's a real powerful combo, So simple that even I can do it.
You didn't have to introduce the servlet nowhere, so it automatically configured
right.
Vaadin servlet.
And we didn't even need to add any annotations to the application class. So we just added the dependency. We added our standard UI and added this single Vaadin UI annotation on top of it, and then it just worked.
I think this is really compelling. I mean, I could have typed this out live if we had just a minute extra.
So you can extend the standard UI class, so you don't need any special UI class.
This is all standard Vaadin stuff. So, and
this is our custom annotation.
This is from the new project that you are working on.
I can. We have. Well, actually, we seem to be running some over the 45-minute limit already. But I'm in spite of this. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about this integration that's coming up. So if I can get my ID on the screen here.
Artem.
There. Okay.
Thank you.
So, as I said, this is something completely new. So this repository was created like 1 day ago or something. So there's still a lot of stuff missing. We have lots of plans.
So do I.
And so this is something definitely worth watching, this repository, because some really neat stuff is going to come up in there. What we have already right now, I'm just not going to look at the actual framework implementation. Instead, we're going to look at some example code. Again, here, this is the standard setup. So this is just the normal Spring Boot stuff. We can have multiple UIs in the same application mapped to different paths here.
So you can also use this parameter here in the annotation, so you don't need a separate.
Exactly. So here in the Vaadin UI, since I don't have a path, this will be mapped to the root, and this one will be mapped to another UI.
Yeah.
And we also have support for themes. We can also support the Navigator API, so we can actually define views using the Vaadin view annotation here, mapping it to different names. We can limit views to different UI classes. So for example, this default view would be accessible in all the subclasses, all the UI subclasses in the project, whereas this my view here is just available for this another UI. We also have a UI scope, a custom Spring scope that makes it possible to tie UI components to the UI instance. And that's about it. That's what we're having implemented so far. Plans for future features, well, there are a lot of them, but at least things that pops into my mind is, of course, internationalization. So we want to have a seamless and very easy integration with Spring internationalization support. We also want a very seamless Spring security integration. And then, of course, we want it to be just as easy as it is now to parameterize and configure your Vaadin servlets, heartbeat intervals, production modes, custom widget sets, and so on. So there's quite some tasks that need to be done before we could actually call this production ready. But at least considering that this is something that didn't exist 2 days ago, I'm actually really excited about this.
And
Likewise.
I'm very confident that you will finish this project.
That'd be great. Where should users go if they want to learn and file issues and feedback
so this
into
is,
what
we're gonna
they wanna see in
post.
this?
I'm not sure if you can see the URL here, but we're gonna post the URL to this GitHub repository right after this webcast. So we're gonna add it below the video on YouTube
And also to the Vaadin forum.
Yeah, and we will add it to the Vaadin forum as well.
Yeah.
And where you can discuss and add questions and so on.
Yeah. We had planned for some...
Very interested in feedback.
We had planned to answer many questions here, but too bad we don't have that much time, but we can take 2 or 3 questions now.
Yeah.
And then if you still have some questions, please keep asking them on the forum, and Petter will try to answer them, and Josh probably also wants to visit our forum to see some inspiration for this new add-on.
Yep. Okay, so questions.
Spring security. That has been a common question from our participants, and how would you integrate Spring security framework with Vaadin US?
Well, short answer is wait for our new add-on to get it working, because we will provide Spring security integration.
So you already have some plans how to...
We have sort of high-level plans. Still need to iron out the details. If you're doing it the old-fashioned way in a Vaadin application, since we're only basically working with one URL, you can't really use any of the URL filters. So what we've been doing previously is that we've been sort of injecting or accessing this Spring Security beans, authentication managers and so on manually, and then in the Vaadin application we're sort of checked manually that is the current user in this role, then disable this, otherwise enable that, and so on. And same goes for different views. So if we're navigating to a specific view, we ask Spring Security, is this user allowed to navigate to this view, and so on. So that's how you did it the old-fashioned way, and the new way hopefully will be a lot easier, a lot cleaner, but we haven't done it yet, so stay tuned.
Another question is probably for Josh. It's actually about performance and about starting up the Spring services and applications that have Spring configured. So they are asking if they can instantiate Spring beans on demand or somehow lazily so that you could get the application running faster.
I think this question's a little misguided. I'm not sure I understand it, but it sounds like the general question is how do I get Spring to start up faster? And to that question, if I get asked it, usually the response is, remove Hibernate. Find the thing that's slowing everything down and remove that, because Spring itself can configure and wire up thousands of beans in seconds. It costs nothing at all to do that. It's cheap as heck, and even faster if you're using Java config and the like. So it isn't endemic to Spring itself. It's something that you're configuring it itself is taking a long time. There are techniques for offloading that work. You can wrap it inside of a proxy and then do lazy configuration, for example. You can actually use @lazy, on the Java config bean, or use lazy itself in the bean type itself, so that the bean itself won't be wired up or instantiated until it's actually injected and used. But if you're depending on that bean in the startup process, then you'll have to pay the cost somewhere. So I would profile that. There's rarely ever a need to actually dynamically create Spring beans.
Find out
performance reasons,
what's slow and why, and then think if you can get rid of it.
And if I didn't understand the question correctly, please feel free to find us on the forum or online. We'll do a better job. I'll do a better job.
Okay, next question.
I think we have time for one more question, and it was about internalization.
Yeah.
But I think at least partly you already answered this.
So basically, the easiest or simplest solution is that you just auto-wire in the message source into your UI, and then you just use the locale from the Vaadin user interface to get messages.
Did you have the example there?
I have an example, but I'm not going to show it here, but you can go to the Vaadin Spring webinar GitHub repository. We will put the link under the video, and there you will be able to find a working example how to do this. If you want to use the sort of marry these two technologies together so that you can use internationalization both in Spring specific stuff and Vaadin specific stuff, you need to do a little bit more coding to get the locale synchronization working between both parts, and there's an example of this in the GitHub repository as well.
We'll probably make that so that it's automatically done for you by
the plugin will do
right?
this in a really, really neat way. We haven't really figured out how yet, but it will be extremely cool.
And transparent, hopefully.
Yeah.
So,
I think we are already a bit late.
Yeah.
And we will end this now here online, but please ask those questions on the forum.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also if I'm always happy to carry the discussion online. If you don't mind, can I give away my Twitter handle?
Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm STARBUXMAN. Feel free to find me there, or always happy to hear from you guys.
Okay.
So
that's about it for now.
Thanks for participating, and we'll be continuing with next webinars in a couple of weeks, if I remember correctly, and then we will be discussing about charts together with Torstein from High Charts from Norway.
That's cool.
And yeah, that's it for this time, and bye.
Bye bye. See you on Git. See you on GitHub. Bye bye.
Bye.